I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar, Promoting Resilient Economies in the Western Balkans, Tackling Corrosive Capital at the Sectoral Level. This is part of CIPE's overall Corrosive Capital initiative, and it's really grown to a corrosive and constructive capital initiative. So we started tackling this issue of corrosive capital at the Center for International Private Enterprise about 4 years ago. To introduce myself, I forgot that. My name is Eric Hans, and I'm the Deputy Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia at the Center for National Private Enterprise. And I also run and coordinate our corrosive capital and constructive capital work. So back to the corrosive capital initiative. And what we noticed was working with small and medium-sized enterprises in emerging markets is that investment was coming in, but it wasn't really benefiting the whole economy. People weren't having access to opportunity. Small businesses weren't growing. Innovation wasn't happening. So what was going on? And it really, working with partners like you see here today in the Western Balkans, but not only in the Western Balkans, in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, we've really developed a robust network of economic think tanks, thinkers about on this topic of corrosive capital. But corrosive capital is not about stopping investment from happening. We want investment to happen. Emerging economies need investment. The question is how to have the investment come in and benefit the most people. How to have it come in transparently, accountably, and at the end of the day, provide more opportunity to more citizens. The Western Balkans is suffering from massive brain drain to Western Europe, and that's something that we don't want to see. It's not a long-term growth strategy. With folks that have immigrated out of the Western Balkans that I've spoken to in Europe, that are working in Europe, would love to go home if there was opportunity there. So talking about corrosive capital, neutralizing the corrosive effects of it, making the economy more inclusive, more responsive, and provide more opportunity is what this initiative is all about. And we have a special tool that we've developed with our partners at CSD called MACPI. And I'll turn it over to Ruslan to get into the nitty-gritty details and to present our panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks indeed for CIPE's support for so many years. I mean, I would like to note that CSD has been CIPE grantee and partner since 1991. And it's great having you back in the region and working together on the concept of constructive capital. I think ever since back in the days, I think it's been of tremendous importance that we attract more and more private capital into this region. And of course, we want to make sure, particularly in this field of, rising globalization, but also of rising international global superpower competition, that we also are careful as to what kind of capital we let in, and also whether there might be cases of corrosive capital that in particular from authoritarian countries, that allows or has some sort of other agenda than just the agenda of profit and making sure that everybody has a fair share in the development of the Western Balkans, and in particular also of all the Balkan countries. So when we discussed this corrosive capital issue, we were particularly happy to work together with our partners from CELDI, a network of anti-corruption good governance institutions in the Western Balkans. And we have today with us two of our partners with whom we worked, Igor Stojanovic, with whom we work in Bosnia and Herzegovina on public procurement, and Misha Popovic, with whom we worked in North Macedonia on special innovation investment zones that we'll present later on. My colleague Alexander Gerganov will start first, and he will present the MACPI tool. And MACPI essentially is a constructive capital instrument. I mean, it was meant to look at us, look at the institutions of the countries that we focus on. And we did focus on 4 countries, on Serbia, Bosnia, North Macedonia, and Montenegro, looking at 4 different institutions. And we're going to present today the findings of this MACPI tool. What we were thinking is always that the reason we have constructive and corrosive capital, and the reason why constructive capital could turn into corrosive, are typically with us. So we want to look into the economies. We want to look at our rules. We want to look at the way we structure the ways of doing business, and we want to make sure that they're corruption-free, that they provide equal opportunities for everyone, and that they actually allow for everyone to get a fair share. And most importantly, that they not lead to monopolization, that they not lead to concentration of power, because concentration of power essentially is one of the most common red flags that show that probably there's something bad brewing. And this has always been the case in open market economies that strive towards a democratic regime. And as you might know, in the Western Balkans and in the Balkans generally, we've had, particularly in the past couple of years, we've had something that we call democratic backsliding. But what's important is that we've been trying constructively to engage with institutions, with businesses on the ground, to actually find ways to close these governance gaps that might allow corrosive capital into the region. So what we've designed as an instrument called MACPI, which was originally meant to strengthen anti-corruption policies within those organizations, is that we try to propose to the management of these institutions that we work with ways of actually closing in governance gaps within their own institutions, and ways of actually finding best practice or converging to some sort of a European, OECD, US level of free market practice. And that has always been important, that we find a constructive attitude from those organizations. And I would like to congratulate our partners and also the institutions that got involved in these, that we think it's very important that we work together so that we make sure that we create these opportunities, as Eric mentioned, so that the region flourishes and benefits from the wonderful human resources that we have, that in many, many cases are actually spread across Europe. So with that, I would, and also at the end, we will have a presentation from my colleague Rumena Filipova, with whom we're working on an upcoming, we'll provide you a glimpse of an upcoming study on media capture, media being a very important party within both the economy and the democratic process, ensuring that the playing field is level, ensuring that questions are asked, ensuring that this creates a rigorous competitive society and economy that doesn't allow for this concentration of capital, very often leads to corrosive capital. Now, before I turn to Alexander Gerganov, who will present our findings from the piloting of the MACPI instrument, let me say a few words about our house cleaning today. I mean, we are doing a recording for our internal purposes, so that will not be published. This is organized as a seminar. That means that you will see us, and you can ask your questions down below in the comments Q&A section. So please, while you hear somebody and you have a question, please post it, and I will make sure to ask this question. There are some rules that you could see my colleagues put in the chat box, reiterating what's important. We'll also add a link to the publication so that you could also download it. I hope that we will make this remaining 50 minutes worthwhile. And I think it's important that we keep the focus on the Western Balkans and on making this kind of missing space of EU enlargement happen in the next year. So give a really clean kind of perspective on that. And without much ado, I'd like to turn it to my colleague Alexander Gerganov for a brief presentation of the findings from the 4 countries. Alexander.
Thank you, Ruslan. Welcome everyone to this event. Thank you for attending it. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to very briefly present you the key conclusions from the piloting of the MACPI instrument. It will be a really brief presentation, given that we have plenty of results from MACPI. It produces a lot of data, so you're encouraged to read the whole report, where you can see much more data and more details about the different public organizations we audited. The first MACPI, first of all, MACPI stands for Monitoring Anti-Corruption Policy Implementation, and it was first created in 2015, and it was called by the European Commission an excellent tool, and since then it has been used to monitor anti-corruption policies in multiple organizations. We decided to adapt it for the purposes of making public organizations in the Western Balkans more resilient to corruption and corrosive capital tool, which can use the corruption corridor to enter a public organization in a country. So basically, MACPI is a management instrument which can be used for enhancing the capacity and internal control functions over the inflow of foreign capital and national budget distribution to foreign companies. And it can be used as a self-assessment tool by the management of public organizations. Of course, it is better that an external organization is doing the auditing, as was in this case. And we piloted this tool in 5 public organizations in Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, and Serbia. These were the Public Procurement Agency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Directorate for Technological and Industrial Development Zones of North Macedonia, the Tax Administration Authorities in Montenegro, and 2 organizations in Serbia, the State Council for the Economic Development and the Regional Development Agency. The MACPI instrument is a tool set of several different instruments. You can see them in the columns here. The MACPI in-depth interviews, which are with the management of the organization. MACPI officials, which, as said, is a survey-based instrument with the officials, the employees of the audited organization. MACPI experts, which is similar to MACPI officials, but with external experts, and MACPI clients, which again is a survey-based instrument which asks specific victimization questions to clients. These are businesses or individuals who are in contact with this particular organization. And you can see the different indicators which MACPI produces. Different instruments produce different indicators, but for most indicators, there is some comparison between different target groups, which gives us important information about possible deviations in the answers. So it is a very cleverly thought out tool, even if I say this myself, and it provides really plenty of data and a lot of insight into the anti-corruption lineup in an organization. And let me move to the key findings to keep this as short as possible. Unfortunately, we found that there is unsatisfactory level of implementation of the existing national level policies and laws at the level of public organizations. What this means is that there are relatively good laws at the national level, but the implementation when they reach the level of public organizations suffers from lack of enough control and sanctions for non-compliance with these internal procedures. And organizations in the region, as you probably know, operate in generally weak governance environment, which has resulted in relatively high corruption pressure levels for all public organizations. And the audited here are not any exception. They also show potential corruption pressure levels, which could be which could lead to the entry of corrosive capital. One positive thing, which is really good, is that there was very strong political will for improvement. All the organizations, except the two Serbian ones, cooperated with MACPI and provided relatively honest assessments of the activities exposed to potential corruption interest. The main vulnerabilities and gaps we discovered, as I said, was connected to the control and sanctions. So the internal procedures, which are supposed to prevent some recognized corruption risks from happening, are not systematically implemented, are not systematically enforced, which means that basically employees could avoid them without any consequences. And this is one problem we find very often in public organizations, that there are good anti-corruption policies and internal procedures. However, they are more or less formal in some cases, in the sense of slightly fictitious, even in more extreme cases, that is there only on paper and not systematically done by the employees, and no one is actually observing whether employees follow them or not. And we found several important vulnerabilities and gaps in the internal procedures of the organizations, which were not recognized by the management. They were identified as such by MACPI. So the management of these organizations did not consider these vulnerabilities, did not think that these vulnerabilities actually existed, and therefore they were not well covered by anti-corruption policies. So this is some thing which could be improved. And finally, unfortunately, both the State Council for the Economic Development and the Regional Development Agency in Serbia refused to participate in the MACPI instrument audit. So we conducted only MACPI experts for these two public organizations, and MACPI experts revealed very high potential corrosive capital pressure. Maybe this was related to the reason for refusing to cooperate with us. We can't say. However, you can see the detailed results from MACPI experts in the full report. And finally, to conclude with some recommendations, MACPI is intended as an instrument which is done periodically. So far, we have done only this first step, the MACPI benchmarking scan, and we provided a very detailed report to the management of the audited organizations with all the data, all the conclusions, all the recommendations. And what is expected of them is to design and implement new or to improve their current policies, to cover the discovered gaps in anti-corruption policy lineup, and in this way to become more resilient to corrosive capital, so that even if corrosive capital tries to enter, it is not possible because of very good anti-corruption policy setup. And finally, this cycle is concluded by another diagnostic scan, which hopefully shows the improvement and shows whether the initially discovered gaps and vulnerabilities are covered. Unfortunately, so far, the management of these organizations haven't expressed interest to do MACPI again, but hopefully this will be a long-term monitoring process which will improve these organizations and not only them. more concrete recommendations we made was that the state aid, investment, public procurement, and tax control activities should be complemented by strong internal policies, revised in a way to effectively stop any potential conflicts of interest, external corruption pressure, or political pressure. Also, the management of the public authorities should pay special attention to any activities related to the direct contact of public employees with clients. As I explained, these are the potential investors, bidders, or taxpayers or businesses. This is very important because these activities are where the actual corruption risks lie and where the potential for the entry of corrosive capital is. And finally, high level of caution should be applied in the process of decision making on granting investment incentives and procurement contracts. So these activities were ranked very high in terms of corruption pressure by the MACPI instrument, while at the same time they are not always recognized by the management of the organization as potential vulnerability areas. So these particular activities should receive more focus. And this is all from me. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I would be glad to address them.
Thank you very much, Alex, for keeping it on time. Again, I would ask everyone to ask their questions in the Q&A box that you should see down below on your panel on Zoom. Also, if you want to ask it in person in the discussion, please raise your hand and we'll make sure that you get that participation. It's important to realize, and I'm sure, Alex, that there will be more organizations coming forward and wanting to do MACPI, but it's important to realize that this is a management improvement tool, and we are working with the clients, with businesses, and I know CIPE is continuing their work on with business chambers across the region, so that it's a continuous process. As I say, it's a cycle that will allow us to close all these gaps that might lead to corrosive capital or to actually constructive capital going someplace else. So I think one of the lessons learned is, in a way, is that essentially, with the exception of Serbia, where I think it's really worrying, the gap between all the difficulty of work between the public institutions and the private sector and the non-governmental sector seems to be very difficult. In all the other countries, we faced quite constructive collaboration with the institutions. And now I'd like to invite two of our local partners. First will be Igor Stojanovic from Bosnia and Herzegovina, with whom we worked with the Public Procurement Agency. Definitely, Igor, one of the most interesting institutions to work with and to see how we can improve their internal regulations so that they stimulate more constructive capital to come into Bosnia. Igor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ruslan. Is it okay with the screen? You can see slides.
I can see it. If you want to put it also in presentation mode, that would be great. Yes, yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Well, equipment usually tends to create some problems always, so it's good to see everything is fine. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to present briefly results and conclusions of our, I would say, research and analytical activities here in B&H. And as Alexander said, we all had some difficulties to convene public institutions to partner with us, although we are on the Balkans, but we all well known that they're not very open and ready to not just cooperate, but also share their internal acts, which was really quite significant task in regards to the Public Procurement Agency here in country. But still, at the very beginning, I would like to thank you once again, to thank them once again and give credits for their openness and readiness to face with sometimes unpleasant questions, but still all other institutions simply rejected. So I think this is at least a very good start, and maybe building some kind of good practice here in country. In short, aside from Public Procurement Agency, CCI, CSD, and CIPE, we did a kind of joint effort in order to conduct not just MACPI, but also some other activities, as you may see on the screen. A little more details about that. So we conducted a few in-depth interviews with PPI representative. Also did a kind of in-depth analysis of their activities, but also internal acts. And when you said internal acts, you should know that there were 38 of internal acts, which is total approximately 200 pages of documents that have been analyzed. And some of them have not been directly related with anti-corruption per se, but still we have been really trying to find any kind of mechanism that control or close the governance gaps in related with managing of the agency. Also, we did research of the existing laws and bylaws here in country in order to be able to compare content of the internal acts with what was demanded by the legislation. And finally, in line with methodology that Alexander described, we did a survey with employees, local independent experts, and PPA clients. Again, I think every country engaged in the project has some specificities here. So it was also related with term clients of the procurement agency, because as you may know, procurement agency is a regulator of the entire system of procuring goods and services within the public institutions. So we, at least no, on their website, there is a kind of register of all companies that are bidding on the procurement processes here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it is approximately 12,000 of names. So in order to did some kind of representativeness about this huge group, we did MACPI on qualified sample of those companies. Key findings, maybe just to briefly mention some of them. The very first one is slightly different that Alexander presented right now. In fact, we do have here a high level of harmonization between the internal acts and the laws here in country. But unfortunately, laws are in some cases, for example, employing staff in any public institution, meaning agency as well, is not very deeply described. Simply to say, almost anybody who fulfill just basic demands like citizenship, age, and being free from any kind of prosecution or verdict in regards to the corruption can become employer of public procurement agency. Since this agency is really managing the system which spends close to 10% of GDP of country, we are still thinking that this needs to be a little bit deeper defined. Unfortunately, majority of public officials here just doing what is strictly demanded by the law. Although something is not demanded or not prohibited, that still is not good argument for them to perform maybe more than law is really requesting. So in key internal documents of PPI, they are harmonized, but still providing some significant room that can be misused either in an economic or political way by any external actor, primarily political parties. Awareness of exposure to corruption pressure is quite underdeveloped among the staff of the agency. observing by two sources of information. One is MACPI, where we had less than 10% of employees which reported any experience facing with corruption. And on the other side, also in-depth interviews provided that with information that there are no any internal processes about education and awareness raising about recognizing or mitigating corruption risks. Also, PPA, I mean, procurement agency here in country, they are providing various consultancies either to companies but also public institutions in conducting public procurement processes, but on the other side also providing trainings and capacity building for the companies about fulfilling all obligations needed. From those processes, they are really gathering a huge experience and lessons learned, but still that is not utilized during the process of improving existing legislation, meaning the law on public procurement here in country. Simply to say, politicians took the entire control of the content of the law during the process of adoption in the parliament, and very often the final adopted version of the law is pretty far from the one initially proposed by the procurement agency to the Council of Ministry here in country. And finally, cooperation between procurement agency and external actors, primarily meaning on CSOs, has kind of downward path, because it is formally prescribed by a rule book on conducting monitoring over the procurement processes in country. And one chapter of that is describing, among others, CSO's reports as a credible source that needs to be used by procurement agency during the process of creation of their annual report on procurement process. Unfortunately, in previous version of that rule book strictly prescribe obligation of the agency to cooperate and take those reports of CSOs in their work, but the latest version moved that to the optional. And although there is some kind of practice of cooperation between them in institutional sense, they somehow moving away from cooperation primarily with media and civil society organizations. Recommendations, of course, are going directly towards improving internal policies, particularly ones related with internal control and audit, conflict of interest, and integrity plan. One example, only a few employees within the agency are obliged to sign a statement on conflict of interest. Just a top management and a few employees who are conducting procurement processes within the agency, but all others, for example, those who are providing consultancy for the companies who are bidding on the procurement processes, are not. So this represents really potential for frauds and misuse of the processes. Education of PPA is also to recommendation goes to bringing this topic high on agenda within the procurement agency. So it's not just to improve control environment, but also help employees better understand risks related with corruption pressure, and also tools to mitigate these risks properly. Establishing communication in external way related with reporting cases of corruption is also very much on the agenda among the proposed recommendations. And finally, also related with the annual report of the agency submitted to the Council of Ministry of B&H, which is primarily statistical document, present dozens of pages about activities conducted, but still almost none recommendations for improving law on public procurement or any other relevant bylaws, thanks to the experience and information gathered during the work of procurement agency. So this is, I would say, very general for this very moment, and I hope we will have some further discussion about this stuff. So maybe some other aspects can be discussed as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Igor. Indeed, it's quite fascinating, and I already see questions in the chat. Please, everybody else, who wants to ask, either in the Q&A box or in the chat, I'll be happy to pose that question. We'll now move to our analysis and findings in North Macedonia, just to stress two critical findings, which are the importance of political commitment and leadership, which is critical in ensuring that fairly well written laws, and as Igor mentioned, aligned internal regulations with those laws are actually implemented. So there's the question of example. And secondly, what Alex mentioned, one of our key findings is, while it seems that the EU is good and we're all good in, through our, also through MACPI, creating this gradual movement forward, so building capacity, doing it step by step. Essentially, what we lack is a solid, well-working mechanism for punishing transgressions. I mean, essentially, this is one of the reasons why we end up here. And of course, this is also on a bigger level, the work of the judiciary within those countries. Misha, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Are you now seeing the screen? The presentation? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ruslan. Thank you to both CIPE and CSD. CSD for basically sharing all the expertise and knowledge in doing the MACPI in institutions in an effort to fight possible inflow or outline the risks where corrosive capital can enter, and also to CIPE for bringing all this together and bringing all these organizations together to work on this. Our study was the foreign direct investments in North Macedonia. Basically, FDIs have tremendous leverage in the country over the political establishment, basically because the economic development is largely dependent on foreign capital. So in mid-2000s, the country started incentivizing investments from abroad with elaborate schemes or case-by-case incentives. So after 2017, the government, the newly appointed government, attempted to make all these state aid more transparent with new legislation, mainly focusing on schemes where everything is known into how incentives on foreign direct investments are given, but also at the same time left parallel legislation exist. There was no single registry of state aid. It was just announced 2 days ago, and the country in general had weak anti-corruption institutional setup, so it is vulnerable to governance gaps. So this was basically a perfect ground for testing the probability, or I mean, testing the loopholes which can exist into allowing corrosive capital, because corrosive capital in essence is capital which exploits governance weaknesses and contributes to democratic backsliding in host countries. So given that FDIs and state aid have two basic pathways of entering. One is through bilateral deals, high-level political engagement between countries which provide the capital and countries which receive the capital, and these are basically almost always done through special laws. And the other is actually using everyday governance weaknesses, in institutions, in the general legislation, to enter and then exploit other weaknesses, such as leverage because of FDIs being, I would say, huge employers in the country. So this is leverage against the political elite, or FDIs situating in a particular economic sector where they have leverage because of the nature of the sector. So we approached the Agency for Investment and the Directorate for Industrial Development Zones to work on applying MACPI in these institutions. The Directorate agreed, and we entered and did the study in 2019, starting from 2018 and going into 2019. So what did we find out? There is some degree of corruption pressure over the Directorate. This has been identified by both employees and the clients of the Directorate, meaning that either employees reported that clients offered bribes, or clients reported that employees asked for bribes. So it is 25% of the employees and 16% of the clients. 25% of the clients and 16% of the officials reported corruption pressure. In analyzing MACPI, we outlined certain key activities of an institution. And we found out that the most vulnerable are attracting investments and support to companies which invested or are starting their investment. The biggest pressure is in support to companies, which is, I would say, expected. When we analyzed, and this was what Alex was talking about in part, was the coverage of anti-corruption policies. So basically, on the left, you see different anti-corruption policies which exist in the institution, and on the top row, you see different activities, essential activities of the institution. And then through the MACPI tool, we identify which activities are not sufficiently covered by anti-corruption policies. And this is, I would say, an important indicator of possible gaps. So support to companies, one of the identified activities with corruption pressure, and attracting investment are, in particular, support to companies are not sufficiently covered by any of the anti-corruption procedures. And this is the most vulnerable, therefore, activity of the institution. And this is the activity where which starts after the initial attracting of investment. So when a company becomes serious in trying to invest, it is taken over by people in the institution, and then they start working together on how to establish the investment in the country. So this is not sufficiently reported, even though not sufficiently covered, but even though it is identified as highly risky. I would say that attracting investment is also not sufficiently covered, or at least it can be covered better, since it is the activity with the most discretion, because it involves discretion by promoters, by agents of the institution whom to approach, how to approach a foreign investor. Also, the MACPI identified recruitment of staff as not sufficiently covered, which can also be a significant risk in the institution. What are the issues which we identified pertaining to corrosive capital and possibly the biggest challenges in allowing corrosive capital to enter a country? It is basically the risk assessment the institutions perform when overviewing a potential investor. So the MACPI revealed that ultimate beneficiary checks financial fitness of investor is a rudimentary procedure. It's not sufficiently proficient, and it rarely involves several institutions which can perform due diligence or risk assessment better than an institution which is tasked to attract investment. So it's not their key role to vet an investor. And the second, I would say, general issue that the analysis finds is that anti-corruption procedures covering attracting investment are averagely effective at best, and they need to be more proficient because this is the most discretionary part in the work of the institutions. So what are the recommendations? So a vetting of potential investors must be introduced. This is particularly important now, since the country is hit severely by the economic effects of the pandemic. It is decreasing the conditions for investment. So this was talked about in the government yesterday, to let some of the conditions more loose. And I think it should be the other way around. The country should make better due diligence and checks. And actually, the incentives should be biased toward companies with proven internal integrity policies. Attracting investments should be left to larger institutions. This is one thing that we also noticed, because in parallel, we see that institutions work in parallel with ministers for economic development, with small cabinets which have which cannot perform better analysis of risks to certain potential investments. So political figures should be introduced at the end of the investment process. So this is in short what our analysis has shown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Misha, and thanks for keeping the time. I'm aware we are a little bit behind schedule, and I want to still allow like 5 or 10 minutes for discussion. I would like now to turn to my colleague Romana Filipova, who will present some of the initial findings from work we're doing with from National Endowment for Democracy on media capture in the Balkans. Again, it adds to this integrity environment, you know, that Misha and Igor have both described, and also Alex. And Romy, if I could ask you to really shorten it to the last 4 slides, that would be great. Thanks a lot, and sorry for pressing you on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so you can see my slides, I guess.
Yes, all good.
Great. So indeed, in presenting some of our key findings, I'm going to shift the focus a little bit from the overall phenomenon of corruption and corrosive capital to their specific manifestation in the media sphere. And it is indeed important to note that media very often supports and facilitates corrosive capital, and therefore it's very important to ensure media freedom in order to also promote a level playing field, fair competition, and also prevent the concentration of capital. And very briefly, just to give you a flavor of our upcoming study, it details the scope, means, and impact of Russian media capture in 8 countries in Southeast Europe. And this is based on a 4-fold assessment. We look at the instruments of Russian media capture, also the channels and narratives that it employs, as well as the impact of Kremlin messaging on societal perceptions, as well as the amplification of Russian media influence through convergence with other authoritarian states, and in particular China, but also Turkey and Hungary. And here it is interesting to note that one of the key similarities that applies to the whole region is the pervasive informality of Russian media capture, which is manifested in the cultivation of opaque local networks of patronage. So this is to say that Russian influence in the media sphere does not really take place through direct ownership of companies who edit particular domestic news outlets, in which ownership can be traced in public registries, national or international corporate commercial databases. To the contrary, Russian media capture happens through informal means, informal political and economic links. And to augment this key instrument of informality, the Kremlin uses a number of auxiliary tools. So in particular, this is related to tapping into and also instrumentalizing advertising revenue. There is also another important cross-regional similarity, which is basically a shared pattern in the context and stylistic modes of Russian disinformation. And here, basically, to put it shortly, the more closely politically and economically enmeshed a given outlet is with pro-Russian groups and interests, then the more straightforwardly and in a more explicitly biased ways that this outlet relates Kremlin disinformation. So this figure basically shows the different types of outlets that we examine depending on their degree of political and economic distance from Russian groups and interests. So as you can see, we studied both outlets which are directly owned by the Russian state, also partisan political outlets, as well as broader dailies that try to appeal to wider audiences. And we also examined independent outlets, so to say, with all due qualifications of what an independent outlet might be, in order to provide a comparative benchmark of how a relatively neutral portrayal of Russia-related events can take place as against the promotion of Russian disinformation narratives. So in addition to all the similarities that we identified as being applicable across the Balkan countries, there are also, of course, important differentiations both among each of those countries, but also among groups of countries. And so to represent that, we created a kind of diffusion map of Russian media capture, which is divided into two main categories, including the susceptible enablers of Russian media capture, but also the unyielding inhibitors, and then the various country differentiations within those categories. So overall, it is important to say that we make this distinction on the depending on the degree of susceptibility of those countries to Russian influence. And also, we identified sub-regional clusters in the way that Russian media capture takes place throughout the region. So basically, we have the sub-regional cluster that consists of Bulgaria and Croatia, which represent the EU nodes, meaning that even though they are susceptible to Russian media influence, they are also part of the European public and media space, which prevent the complete takeover of their informational environment by Russian messages. And on the other hand, we have the sub-regional cluster, which consists of the post-Yugoslav states other than Croatia and Slovenia, and which represent, so to say, a heritage side. And Russia really deftly employs the legacies of post-Yugoslavia in order to promote its media capture practices. One of those instruments is, of course, the knowledge of Serbian language, Serbian minorities, but also the legacies of war, victimization, and division among the countries. So what happens next? How are we to tackle this phenomenon, the widespread phenomenon of Russian media capture throughout the region? So in the study, we outline a number of recommendations, and I will just focus on a few here. And in particular, it's very important to consider the introduction of specific provisions on the scope and origin of capital foreign ownership of domestic media outlets. Also, on the more general level, it's important to create EU-wide binding obligations to disclose ownership information, and that there should be a common European registry, and therefore there should be common standards of monitoring and implementation of that registry, which applies across the EU countries, but also candidates, I would say. Also, and this is part of the context of the hotly debated EU funds and the conditions on which they are to be distributed. And here it's important to pay specific attention to EU communications funds, which should also be made conditional on the full disclosure of the allocation procedure, because as we know and as we saw from our study, this allocation procedure is frequently abused. And the EU should also exercise much more vigilance, and it should monitor the incursion of Russian and Chinese state-owned media into the European media space. And ultimately, what underwrites all of that in a way is that it would be good for us to actually initiate a fundamental rethinking of the existing binary, I should say, media ownership models broadly divided between the commercial model and the state-led model, both of which have very significant downsides and which affect media freedom in a negative way. So for updates on our full report, which will be coming out this month, you can check our website and also our Facebook page. Thank you.
Thanks, Rumi. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and thanks for keeping it on time. We are already above our beyond our initially announced time, so I don't want to stretch this very much, and I thank very much our speakers. But I still want to come back to, because there were two very good questions. I still want to come back to our speakers, to Alexander, Igor, and Misha. And if Eric has something to add at the end. There seems to be, I mean, in Europe, we've been agonizing as to what to do about it. I mean, essentially, because we are used to free markets, to democracy, so we're not used to labeling. In particular, capital. You know, when we work at, you know, when we look at the inflow of capital, so we rely on the functioning of our rules and institutions, and that the invisible hand will sort this out. The question is that it seems, and from what Rumena also showed, it's more and more likely that there is intentional kind of capital inflows from authoritarian regimes. And then it also seems, and I think Europe is exhibit number one on this, that if you respond as if nothing happens, as if you're dealing all over the place with democratic market economies, you might end up always kind of drawing the shorter stick. That means that you will end up with corrosive capital essentially getting in, corroding certain parts of your economy, certain low-hanging kind of a more compromised economy, if you want to, and then gradually this will splinter your internal alliances and your internal markets. I mean, essentially what Rumena mentioned on media capture, you know, because this keeps bringing all these issues. And I'd like to just very briefly note here, and I see that the question disappeared from Misha, who was who asked this, you know, whether the focus should be on, and I hope I remember it correct, whether the focus should be on stricter enforcement, or it should rather be on the more open kind of functioning of the rules and regulations. And number two are questions from Radu Kotici, and with that we're finishing, and I'll ask you for really brief answers, 1-minute answers. If so, MACPI seems to be very close to, very similar to corruption risk assessment in public institutions, with the Western Balkans seems to be implementing. I wasn't really 100% aware of that, but the question is how to synchronize the two processes. So this is maybe a question to Alexander. So let's start with Alex, and then Igor and Misha, 1 minute final words. Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting question. Indeed, first to Radu's question, the MACPI toolset was initially designed to fulfill this mandatory corruption risk assessment need, which is mandatory not only in the Western Balkans, but all across Europe. And indeed, so far, it has been used in more than 20 public organizations, and many of them, for example, in Italy, in Spain, in Romania, use the MACPI instrument as a part of their fulfillment of this mandatory obligation to do corruption risk assessments. So this methodology, however, is standardized, and it is created by people who are experienced in doing quantitative methodological quantitative assessments and high quality methodologies. So basically, this is why it received such high praise by the European Commission, and it can be used as a complementary instrument together with the regular corruption risk assessments, which are conducted in Serbia, or as I explained, it can be used to fulfill this mandatory requirement if there is interest. This has been done by other public organizations successfully so far. And to very briefly touch the other question about the possible deregulation, when MACPI assesses anti-corruption policies, this doesn't mean that more rules will be added. It can be the other way around as well. So the MACPI instrument tries to assess the good rules. So basically, one of our ideas when we created this was that bad and unnecessary and potentially even harmful internal procedures could be alleviated a bit based on the MACPI results. And it is a long-term monitoring tool, as I explained. Ideally, when anti-corruption setup is improved, the corruption pressure also declines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Indeed, in Bulgaria, what we found out is that we did one organization full and second MACPI, and then they found out that the policies were working, and that scared a lot of people off. So we haven't had a third one, but we hope that this is going to be happening. Igor, for your final words, thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan. Obviously, if nothing else, but I think we did a really great difference in addressing the need of public institutions to ensure proper control over the corrosive capital. Although this term is still something that we need to communicate in our states. But aside from Ruslan said a few minutes ago about authoritarian countries, black money, I mean money laundering and space for investing or putting that money into the official processes here and taking the control thanks to that is also equally, at least equally corrosive on the society as those ones. So I think this issue really needs to be held as high as possible on agenda. And I think we made not one, but a few very good steps in these regards. Also, as Alexander said, I think nature of MACPI to act as a management tool is also something new, because in the past, usually CSOs conduct various campaigns based on confrontation with public institutions, and they become quite hesitating to cooperate anymore. But I think this tool can provide some kind of insider information and very concrete recommendations related with their specific needs. And I think they will appreciate it very much. So maybe this kind of helping hand, so-called, that to them could bring some difference as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Igor. So Eric, there is more need for us to step in our work. Misha?
Yeah, to the question of Radu, in North Macedonia, it's not really clear about whether corruption risk assessment is mandatory, but this even makes it greater than the directorate accepted to work with us. But yeah, I agree that corruption risk assessment is probably the best tool, and MACPI is like that, to work on this issue. And as for the second question, I answered it in writing.
Thank you so much, Misha. Thanks everyone for your presentations today, and thanks to our guests who kept even 10 minutes above our initial timing. Eric, do you want to have any final words?
No, I just have to thank everybody for sticking around. I see that most participants have stuck around for the extra 10 minutes. But this is a big topic. We've got several countries here, each with their own specific nuance, several strategies to fight or to highlight the corrosiveness of capital. And I think that, Igor made a really good point here as we have a spectrum of investment, from black to white, right? But in between that gray space, and that's where a lot of questions occur. So how do we separate the capital that's in that gray space between black and white from healthy, constructive capital that helps increase opportunities for people, from those negative effects, from the corrosiveness of the capital that really drags down and undermines an economy. So that's where I think we're going to continue our work, and thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to the attendees.
Thank you very much. Have a great day in the US on the other side of the Atlantic. Have a really good afternoon and evening to everybody else here on the Balkans and in Europe. And we look forward to our next presentations, as we're looking forward to the report that Romana promised at the end of the month. Thanks again to CIPE, Center for International Private Enterprise, and the National Endowment for Democracy for making this possible. And we look forward to working with you together again. Stay safe, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.